At the comprehensive tax reform meeting today, Dr. Alexander Holmes said that anyone who wants to eliminate the income tax is showing willful ignorance. He also used the phrase willful negligence. I know OCPA has put out there that they want the income tax eliminated. So talk to me about your willful ignorance of how the state's finances are done.
Well, first of all, thanks, Peter, for allowing us to participate. One of the great things about phasing out the income tax is that there's actually a lot of data that helps support that idea. For instance, the 9 states that don't have an income tax versus the 9 states with the highest top rates, when you look at their GDP growth over the last 10 years, the states without an income tax grew at a rate of about 58%. And the states with an income tax grew at a rate of right around the 35% range. So there's definitely a good disparity there between the growth in those economies with states without an income tax versus the growth in economies of states that have one. Some other great data is, for instance, on employment growth. If you look at employment growth in states that don't have an income tax, those states also have employment growth of around 5%, where states with an income tax, they actually saw their employment decline by roughly 1.6%. Oklahoma also has a great story about eliminating its income tax, or what happens when you lower taxes. I don't know if you remember back in the 2005 range, back when the legislature passed some of the first significant tax cuts, bipartisan passage of tax cuts actually, there was some estimates that the state was going to lose $150 million when it lowered taxes, but actually it ended up gaining by 2007. In the year they thought they were going to lose $150 million, they actually gained over $315 million a year in income taxes, and then on the sales tax side, they ended up gaining $243 million over that period of time. So the tax cuts help participate in generating an over $500 million extra in revenue. What's also interesting about that is if you look at the total state and local tax growth in states without an income tax, their local and state revenue has actually grown 120% over the last 10 years from the most available data, compared to states with an income tax that saw their total state and local revenue only grow 60%. So obviously anyone that's talking about this issue wants to make sure that they clarify, we're not talking about getting rid of it overnight. It's something that you phase in over a 10-year period. And with the natural growth that happens, it's definitely a possibility.
It was also brought up by one of the other presenters that you can't have comprehensive tax reform without also having comprehensive spending reform. And he also mentioned that he saw it as a train, and you have an engine and the cars, and the cars are taxes, and that the engine that's driving it is the spending. And so you can't take care of one without taking care of the other, but it's actually spending that's literally driving the train, not the taxes.
Definitely would agree with that. If you think about it, if we didn't need government to spend money, we wouldn't have any taxes in place. So definitely taxes only exist because of government spending that's taking place. And even in the case of Oklahoma, we see a great case over the last decade from fiscal year 2001 to 2010. Total state spending just from the state's primary funds grew from $9.6 billion to over $16.6 billion. And as you've pointed out with your great work at the Watchdog, that revenue never declined over that 10-year period. And even you go back and look back at the 90s, total state spending has never declined. So it's definitely a case of where our spending is driving the policy, and if we can control spending, there's an opportunity to let people have more of their own money.
The argument of equity was also brought up, and it was also mentioned equity is in the eye of the beholder. But states like Texas have no income tax, but they have property tax that goes to the state as opposed to just counties or school districts. Some states may have higher sales taxes, and that's seen as more regressive. Hits the lower income as a larger percentage than, say, an income tax would. How do you balance? Why is it the income tax the one that gets eliminated and not sales tax or property tax?
I think probably what you want to look at with the income tax is that you want to remove disincentives for work. And most people are going to work in a job where they are going to be making income on a per hour basis. And the income tax is that barrier to you working the extra hour, if you will. And so I think that by eliminating the income tax, you then encourage people to work. One of the other things that I think is really important to point out is that OCPA is working on data, and we're almost finished with it, but we're going to end up actually showing that you don't have to increase revenues for any other source. You don't have to increase the rate on property taxes or sales taxes or any other rate. Just by gradual growth in the economy and the dynamic effect over a period of time, you would be able to eliminate the income tax without having to increase the tax burden from any other source.
What do you see? You mentioned that OCPA has its ideas that it's going to be coming out with. You have a comprehensive tax reform task force. You have a tax incentives task force. I've seen legislators putting out press releases on, we need to eliminate the income tax. Do you see, will we definitely have something this coming session that is going to be dealing with this?
I think you definitely will. That task force, which was born out of SJR 61, is dealing with an antiquated provision that we have in our Constitution that basically says intangible property, all intangible property has to be assessed property tax. Obviously, that's a huge problem and is going to be fixed, so that's one area that's definitely going to be addressed. But then also you've seen the governor and multiple lawmakers, whether it was Representative Newell or other lawmakers in the Senate, Senator Mazie, they've all stated their wish, Representative Dank, they've all stated their wish to try to look at either significantly reducing the income tax or eventually eliminating it. So I think it's definitely a reality that there's going to be significant reform this session, and we'll just see how that all plays out.
And finally, it was brought up that in comparing Oklahoma to some of these states, Oklahoma has actually seen more growth as a percentage than some states that have no income tax, like Tennessee or Florida, and I think Washington was the other one talked about. Part of that is also, the whole mathematics of things, that Oklahoma's working from a smaller base, so any increase is going to be seen as larger. Do you think that eliminating the income tax in Oklahoma will then be an added boost on top of that? In other words, Oklahoma might be the top of the charts, so to speak, because we're already doing good with an income tax.
Definitely. I think if you look at a great study which was done by the American Legislative Exchange Council and Dr. Art Laffer, the guy that has a curve named after him, they show in that study that right now Oklahoma ranks about 14th in the country as far as total economic competitiveness. So we're in a good spot, but we're not one of the top performers. And one of the great things about phasing out Oklahoma's income tax without replacing it with anything, that ends up putting Oklahoma in the position where we will quite likely have the lowest tax burden in the lower 48. Based on some of the data that we're seeing and going to get everything finalized, you're talking about probably a pretty great opportunity there.
All right, and I know I said the last one was finally, but you talk about phasing out the income tax. Are you talking about 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Do you have a number in mind?
I think that everyone that's talking about it, and if you talk to economists, and the way to do it, or for it not to be disruptive, is you've got to look at some sort of window of 7 to 10 years. So otherwise, it's too big a hit in the beginning to revenues. It's not able to make those kinds of adjustments in a couple years to government spending. But definitely, when you're looking at a period of 7 to 10 years, it's doable.